Good day from Tokyo. Welcome to ADBI Featured Speaker Seminar. I'm Tetsushi Sonobe, the Dean and CEO of ADBI. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Vegard Skirbekk as our featured speaker. He is a professor at Columbia Aging Center, Columbia University, and a senior researcher at Norwegian Institute of Public Health. His research focuses on understanding the links between aging, health, and the individual's productivity in countries undergoing demographic change around the world. Today, he will present a new measure of aging burden based on the aging-related health of the adult population. He named this new measure the Health Adjusted Dependency Ratio, or HADR. Based on HADR in 188 countries, he will discuss whether this measure is a better predictor of changes in per capita healthcare expenditure than the standard old age dependency ratio, or OADR. He will then explain how clearly the HADR can indicate that there is much less variation in the burden of aging across countries than has previously been assumed. This implies that the old ADR probably overestimates the burden of population aging in many demographically older countries, and that it underestimates the aging burden in many demographically younger countries. The discussion will be followed by a question and answer session with the audience. So please put your questions and comments in the Q&A box. Now, please welcome Professor Vegard. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sonobe, and also thank you, Hirogawa. Thank you, the organizational team, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event, which I'm honored to participate in from the Asian Development Bank Institute. I will start off by sharing. Excellent. So this is work which I've done partly in Norway and the US, but also at the Norwegian National Center on Aging and Health, where I'm affiliated. And I will start off by giving a bit of the basics, change in the world, and why aging might be perhaps misunderstood to a great extent. So this is the worldwide age distribution in the world. And as you can see, there's it used to be a pyramid, but now it has flattened out with much less variation among those below 35 or so in terms of population size, where among all the cohorts there has been the share of each older age group is successively smaller. The older one is. However, this conceals very different age distributions in different parts of the world. So these are three example countries which exemplifies these differences, where you have rapid growth in parts of the world, including demographic Republic of Congo. Slow growth has been observed in the US, and also negative growth has been observed for many parts of increased number of countries in the world, including Germany and also parts of East Asia, where populations are much more rapidly aging. Now, the question is not so much on whether a country is aging, but it's at which stage the country is at, and at how fast the country is undergoing the transition to high life expectancy. This graph shows the development for the last 1.5 centuries. And you can see that in some of the countries, such as Sweden or Belgium, with the green and red line, you see that life expectancy around 150 years ago was in the mid-late 30s, early 40s. and it gradually increased over time. Over the course of the next 150 years, life expectancy gradually increased to levels which are closer to what they are observed today, to around 80 and beyond 80. And basically this relatively slow transition enabled countries to adapt to the changing context of lower and lower mortality rates and changing age distributions. Now, what is happening in many other parts of the world is that there is a decrease in mortality, especially at older ages. In recent years, life expectancy has been increasing. Age-specific mortality has dropped at older ages, but it has happened much more rapidly. So much of the same changes that we observe we observed over the last 150 years can be observed over the course of just half a century in countries such as the United Arab Emirates, Vietnam, or Guatemala. So life expectancy is partly converging between these countries. In the 1950s, it used to vary tremendously, with down to around 40 years, for example, for Vietnam, but then it increased to mid 70s and above in over the course of the mid-late 20th century. So nowadays there's much less variation across country in life expectancy, which means that age distributions will increasingly grow older in all countries in the world, because this is almost a universal phenomenon. These developments made the UN conclude the following: that there is a substantial degree of population aging expected over the next few decades in all regions of the world. It's unlikely that policy interventions intended to encourage childbearing in low fertility countries would substantially alter this expectation, and no plausible assumption about international migration would have more than a moderate impact on the expected degree of population aging that will be experienced in future decades by countries all over the world. The question is not so much whether we age, but how well we age. And this is what my talk will be on today. It's also important to note that even if mortality rates are partly converging, there's much less variation than there used to be. People are living longer and longer almost everywhere. There's huge variation still in global fertility levels, where the difference in fertility varies from above 5 in some countries to, especially in parts of the sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Western Asia, to levels which are around 1 child per woman on average in countries such as South Korea, parts of East Asia, but also some European countries have seen fertility drop to these levels. And but in any case, there is an increase in median ages over time. This graph shows the increase in median ages in a select few countries. You can see that, for example, Japan used to have a lower median age in 1980 compared to, for instance, Northern Europe. But following rapid increases in life expectancy, median ages increased a lot in Japan, and is likely to continue to increase to some extent in the years ahead, but then to flatten out in the mid-late 50s. Other parts of the world, they are undergoing the same transition. And for example, if you look at China, you find that the increase is now going more rapidly in China than in Japan, and we're likely to see a partial convergence in median ages between Japan and China. China currently has fertility rates which are somewhat lower than Japan, contributing to this development. While the case is developing somewhat slower in, for example, Northern Europe, but there's a catch-up in countries over time in other parts of the world, such as Latin America and or India. Importantly, this aging is much more than a number. Demography is not destiny, and growing older does not necessarily can mean very different things in different countries. And a key reason for why it matters, why it has so different effects, is the differences in functional levels. So cognitive function is a key measure of aging. Cognition is important for work-life productivity, your job performance, how well you perform in the work life, especially the capacity to work at later ages. More and more countries are introducing retirement reforms to increase labor force participation at older ages. This depends heavily on how well people are able to work at older ages, how productive they are, what is their productive potential. And evidence suggests that there's likely no other measure of productive potential other than cognition that predicts productivity as well. But it also has important implications for probably almost all facets of life, including well-being and quality of life, independent living opportunities, autonomy, ability to function well in one's family life, and also how it has implications for how long you will live, how your likely life expectancy will be. This is a graph which shows development from the early 1990s in terms of cognitive and physical needs in the workplace. And even in this fairly recent periods, the last few decades, comparing different birth codes, those born from the 1930s to the 1960s, you do find for all birth codes that there's a decrease in the need for physical strength, physical capacities in the workplace. That becomes less important. And this is based on both changes in the composition of jobs in the economy, but also in terms of how what are the skills needed within each job? How important is, for example, physical and cognitive skills to be a farmer or an industrial worker? And at the same time, as there's been a decrease in the importance of physical skills, there's been an increase in the need for cognitive skills in the workplace, which has been much stronger. And this is seen for all cohorts across the board and has accelerated in recent years. Cognition is becoming more important for work performance over time. In terms of demographic change, this is important. Cognitive function does differ by age. For example, processing of novel information, ability to comprehend new information tends to decline by age. Memory function tends to decline. Speed of processing new information declines. But also, there's some cognitive capacities that tend to be relatively stable or increase by age. And one example is here verbal knowledge. Psychologists often term these abilities that tend to be relatively stable with age as crystallized abilities, while those who tend to decline as fluid abilities. And this is important because there's been also a change in the importance of all cognitive skills, but there's also an increased importance of some of the fluid skills over time, fluid abilities. One needs to adapt to learn new working practices to learn how to function well in the workplace and elsewhere. Now, there's not only differences in cognition by age on average, but there's also differences in cognitive age trajectories across nations. So this is based on a publication where we estimated. We received the data representing the majority of the world population in terms of representative cognitive skills across nations. And we find that there's large differences where if you look at immediate word recall, where one is given 10 simple words to remember, has 60 seconds to recall as many of them, and the share on the vertical line shows the proportion of these words one is able to correctly recall. One finds that there are large differences across nations, where, for example, Europe and Northern Europe tend to perform better across most age groups, and Central Europe is in the middle. Southern Europe perform comparatively worse, especially at older ages. China is performing worse at most stages, but somewhat better at the older stages, and the same goes with India. This might have to do with selective survival. And and accounting for this, so rather than using the old age dependency ratio, which is still the most common way of measuring aging, where one typically looks at the proportion age 65 plus over those 15 to 64 or 20 to 64, one finds a very different measure. So if you only look at if you use the standard demographic measure, the old age dependency ratio, which is supposed to say something about how dependent a country is based on how many older people there are in the population relative to those in working ages, potential working ages. You find huge variation across countries. You find that India has the youngest population with the lowest share among 65 plus. followed by Mexico, China, the US, Northern Europe, Continental Europe, and Southern Europe. But if you account for not only demography, but also how well people function, and you assume that people are not functioning poorly when they are 65, but they're functioning poorly when they remember less than half the words in the memory test, also accounting for distributions, even in countries with low performance, there's still high shares, substantial shares who perform relatively well, remember the majority of words in the test, you find a very different rank ordering. And what we find there is that the US, partly because of its relatively younger age structure compared to some of the other older countries, and Northern Europe actually have a lower dependency ratio than India, Mexico, Continental Europe, or China. While Southern Europe, for these, according to these estimates, are performing poorly, both because they have a relatively old age distribution, but also a high share that performs below the threshold. So why does cognition differ by age? Well, one important aspect is that education is very important. This is a proportion with this secondary school, and we find that it closely reflects the situation we see in terms of age distribution, in terms of cognitive skills, where countries that have invested more in age tend to perform better. And this is an important tool. It's a highly policy relevant tool. It's not too sensitive to introduce, so for example, pension policies can be. But the problem is, of course, it takes a very long time from you introduce this policy, which tends to affect people very early in life, to see the effect at older ages. It could take half a century or even more. So education is likely very important, and we also have done causal analysis suggesting that educational increases lowers the proportion with poor cognition in the population, accounting for selection when there's compulsory shifts in educational length and there's no self-selection into higher education. One other aspect which can be important for how well a country ages, so how it deals with the demographic transition, which can be very important for Japan, is the cultural factors, for example, those affecting female labor force participation. This graph shows the development by course over time in the US, and you can see that the share among US women working has increased from around 40% to almost 80% among later born cohorts. For men, it has remained quite stable. While in other countries such as Turkey, it has stayed at relatively low levels, slightly below 40%, and it has not increased to the same extent as what has been observed in the US and many other Western countries in particular. And this means that, for example, if a country such as Turkey, even if it has a very low old age dependency ratio, if you look at the economic dependency ratio, if you look at those economically active, you find that the proportion inactive is relatively high in Turkey. And this is largely driven by the fact that women do not tend to work. Japan has a very high old age dependency ratio, and it also has a mid-level economic dependency ratio, and it suggesting that there is strong potential for Japan to increase its female labor force participation and thereby lower the impact of population aging. Norway has a fairly relatively mid-level old age dependency ratio, but a fairly low economic dependency ratio because of the high levels of female labor force participation. Norway is one of the highest labor force participation among women in the whole world. And again, I keep on stressing cultural issue, but I think it's important and it's often overlooked by economists, me being one, until I realized how important this aspect really is. So I spent a lot of time focusing on this. And if you look at cognition, cognitive outcomes, you find that in countries where there's more negative views towards women in the labor force, and this is the share of women, now share of the population arguing that men should have more rights to a job than a woman in the case of job scarcity. You find that in countries such as India or Ghana, slight majorities are likely to say yes, men should get priority for jobs if there's a scarcity of jobs. But it also relates to women doing relatively worse cognitively than men. They, in terms of relative female advantage in female word recall, in these countries, women do worse: Italy, Russia, China, Portugal, Spain, South Africa, India, and Ghana. While in countries where very few argue that this is the case, where very few believe that men should have more rights to a job than women, you find that women do better than men. There's a higher share of women than men who perform well. And we also did various types of causal analysis to identify causality, and we do find that there is a causal pathway that in countries where there's more gender equality, female brains function better. Women have higher cognitive scores than men in terms of immediate recall, at least. So this is now focused on economics, on cognition, and in terms of the international comparison with comparative assessment in terms of cognition, there are also challenges. So even if you have China and India and the majority of the world's population, we do lack measures which cover most of the world's countries. And cognition is only one aspect of everyday functioning and health. And it's important also to account for different aspects of health, which can be important for how well you function, how long you can be active in the workforce, in social life, in family life, and enjoy a high quality of life. So what we did in a very recent study, which just came out a couple of days ago in Lancet Healthy Longevity, we introduced the Health Adjusted Dependency Ratio. And again, the old age dependency ratio assumes that dependence occurs from age 65, yet health predicts better, dependence better than chronological age, and the health adjusted dependency ratio assumes dependence depends on health condition rather than age. So we use this to show how the burden of aging would be if we assume that everyone would get old at a given health level, not at a given age, just as 65. And to do this, we use a global burden of disease data. So this was estimated for the vast majority of the world's countries, 232 countries. We have data of 195, all the major ones, and we identify diseases that were age-related, which is a slight majority of diseases. And we looked at when they occur, and we compare and the prevalence of these diseases, and we compare health levels of individuals across the world with the health levels of a global 65-year-old. And in terms of a global 65-year-old, we find that in countries such as Afghanistan or Papua New Guinea, it is around 50 years or below. They grow much older, younger. Their health is at the same level in Papua New Guinea in the mid-40s as a person would be in his or her mid-70s in Switzerland or Japan. Hence, countries that have better health by age are able to have a much lower health adjusted dependency ratio because they are experiencing old age, if you like, based on this definition at a much later age. So we assume we use, if you look at the bottom formula, the health adjusted dependency ratio assumes that the numerator consists of those in relatively ill health, those with worse health than a global 65-year-old, while the dependent population include those in better health, better than a global 65-year-old. This map shows the world in terms of the normal way of assessing aging, the old age dependency ratio, and you find that the countries that are youngest in the world are much of Africa, Saudi Arabia, parts of Asia, including Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, while the oldest parts of the world is Japan, followed by parts of Western Europe in particular, Finland, Sweden, France, Germany, and countries that are in between are the US or parts of Eastern Europe, Norway, Australia. But if you account for health and also account for demographic distributions, we also do account both of the population distributions, and when you actually get old, based on your health level, you find a very different distribution. So this is the world according to the Health Adjusted Dependency Ratio, and we do find that the world is has a very different rank ordering of dependency, where, for example, countries such as Japan grows relatively. It's not the youngest country in the world, but it's fairly young. It has a similar dependency ratio, such as India or Egypt or the US or Argentina. While some of the youngest countries in the world are found in for example, Mexico, still Saudi Arabia, but you do find that countries such as Sweden or Norway has a much lower dependency ratio than, for example, countries such as Somalia, Central African Republic, and India. And the reason is that they have better health. They have the experience of poor health at much later ages than what the case would be for the other countries. So this has important implications in terms of how world regions, how old world regions are, and how one should perceive the world in terms of demographic change. So the health adjusted dependency ratio and old age dependency ratio for major economies is shown in this graph. And we've shown that countries, especially Japan, is not because I presented it for this audience, but it really is an outlier. It has very good health, but a very old population structure. If you account for health, you find a very that Japan is a very is about the same as India, has the same health adjusted dependency ratio as in India, and much younger than actually the EU, Russia, even the US, and more similar to other major economies such as which are demographically younger, such as Indonesia. So our study suggests a high dependency in parts of Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, Eastern Europe, based on the health adjusted dependency approach, while nations in Oceania, East Asia, Western Europe, North America, Central and South America have lower dependency, tend to have lower dependency. And this might reflect differences in health investments, and we go in detail in that in the paper. We don't, I don't go so much in detail here, but we do find that countries where there's a high level of health investments, they have a lower health adjusted dependency ratio. So investing in health, at least based on associative evidence, seems to have strong effects on how well they undergo the demographic transition. So this graph shows the world again in a bit more detailed manner, where you find that countries from some parts of the world, Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, Eastern Europe in particular, and parts of Africa are older than what their demography would suggest, because they are performing, their poor health occurs much earlier in life than what the case is in other parts of the world. If you, while the opposite case is found in many countries in Western Europe, for example, which has a health adjusted dependency ratio, which is much closer to the global average, which is the stippled line, as you can see. And this is also the case for Northern America, which is much closer to the average age, and also countries in many parts of Africa tend to be much closer to the line, and closer, especially to Western countries and Asia, East Asia, than what would be the case if you only used old age dependency ratio. Hence, and these countries, especially in Western Asia, and also actually Eastern Europe, which is increasing in life expectancy, seeing increasing life expectancy now, are likely to they will undergo aging strongly in the years ahead, and it's important that they invest enough in health, so their health adjusted dependency ratio will not be so much higher than what the current situation is, because it could go as shown in many parts of the world, including Eastern Europe, parts of Melanesia and so forth. There is and Central Asia, the situation is much worse if you do not due to poor health occurring early. And this diagram shows the world again according to the old age dependency ratio. You find huge differences across countries, where Africa and the Middle East and North Africa have very low old age dependency ratios, while Europe, without Central Eastern European countries, Central Eastern Europe, and Latin America and the Caribbean tend to have very high old age dependency ratio. But if you look at the horizontal line, the health adjusted dependency ratio, you find that these world regions tend to be very similar. Africa is very similar to Europe, and the only outlier is Central and Eastern Europe, which is due to its poor health, has a much higher health adjusted dependency ratio, while the Middle East and North Africa is still slightly younger, but only slightly, and much more similar to what the rest of the world is. So to conclude, accounting for health, the dependent share is much more similar for richer and poorer countries in the world, the north and the south, the west and the east and the southeast. There's not really an old and young part of the world. The world is much more similar in terms of its dependency. It also means there's the challenges related to demographic change are much more similar, and will be increasingly similar in the years ahead, because many countries that are currently young are undergoing very rapid aging, as we saw in the initial slides, and means that they will have to adjust to a much greater extent than what they've done now in terms of increasing health investments, increasing education, increasing social norms, including especially gender norms and views on women in the labor force, in order to deal well with aging. Parts of the world, such as Japan, East Asia, Western Europe, are the world's oldest regions, but it has relatively low old age dependency ratios due to late onset of disease. And what the future will be is quite uncertain. But I think unfortunately, I think many of the countries that are currently undergoing rapid demographic change are not likely to be able to, or willing to, or prepared to invest enough in health, especially old age health, as they should do, and this will influence how well they will cope with the inevitable demographic change in the time ahead. I would also like to use a minute to highlight a book which just came out on not so much on life expectancy and mortality and aging, but one of the key drivers, namely low fertility, and it focuses on how the spread of low fertility, which has spread all over the world. The world total fertility rate has fallen from 5 in 1950 to 2.2, 2.3 today in 2020. The causes are not that well understood. More and more countries in the world are experiencing below replacement fertility. The world's 15 largest economies all have now, with the inclusion of India, below replacement fertility. So countries representing around 80% of world GDP, the 15 largest economies in the world, all have below replacement fertility. And policies to increase fertility has been largely unsuccessful, at least in the longer term. So many demographers see it as inevitable that fertility will fall to an increasing number of countries. It will remain low, and whether how low it will go is still uncertain, but it will probably remain below replacement fertility levels at 2.1 approximately in more and more countries all over the world. And to understand the causes of why this has changed, I've written this book called Decline and Prosper, and it basically argues that we need a holistic approach. We need not to only focus on particular aspects. I work in an interdisciplinary research group here. Some are interested in biological mechanisms related to, for example, semen quality, which may or may not be declining, to ovary reserves to how biological reasons for primary and secondary infecundity, and these groups tend not to discuss so much or talk too much with those interested in the social causes of low fertility, including postponement of childbearing, low onset of family formation, late onset of family formation due to economic factors, housing price increases, educational increases, a wish to date for long periods of time, to travel around the world. And in order to understand these developments in a holistic manner, I tried to summarize the research field and present it in one book. So if you're interested in that, this book is now available. So with that, I think I'll leave it for questions and comments. So thank you again very much for listening, and I look forward to your replies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vegard, for a very interesting presentation. We will now open the floor to a Q&A session for the next 20 minutes or so, assuming we have questions by the audience for that length of time. If I could just ask one question to kick things off, and I know Professor Ogawa will have something to say as well. So basically what you're saying is that we should be considering health rather than age when we look at dependency ratios. So what are the implications of this then for retirement ages? Should we disregard those completely?
Not at all. First of all, health is a key driver of retirement ages. So if you do have invested enough in health, your retirement policies are much more likely to be successful. Plus that if you have, in a modern economy, health working longer can likely be beneficial for health, improve your health levels and probably also your cognition, and provide meaning and also help societies to become more fiscally sustainable in face of population aging. So I think investments in health is a precondition for increasing retirement ages.
Okay, thanks. Professor Ogawa?
Yes.
Do you wish to say something? Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, well, Vegard, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. And you certainly hit one of the hottest issues in the study on population aging. In the past, I would say 10 years or so, I think many people started asking the question or need for remeasuring population aging. And thinking you are the first one actually who started making some progress on this particular, along this line of interest. And particularly, I was interested in your paper published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences in 2012. And, you know, that's a cognition adjusted dependency ratio. And that was quite interesting. And using that paper here at the ADB, I started working with Dean Sonobe and Taiyo Fukai and applying that framework to the J-star. And then I compared the result with the ones you generated, they published in that paper. I found something interesting. You know, the United Nations population projection shows Japan's aging, the aging level is worse in the entire world. But well, I calculated a cognition adjusted dependency ratio for Japan. Well, Japanese level is not as bad as the many European countries. In fact, it's somewhere in the middle of the, I would say, the continent European level, and slightly better than France, and slightly worse than the Germany, somewhere between them, and definitely way better than Southern European countries. And I calculated similar to the indices for other Asian countries like Malaysia, Mars data, and also the HART Thailand data. And the particular Malaysian data shows very interesting. It's very close to the Southern European level, and Thailand is a little bit behind, but I think the considerable variability within the Europe. And the point is that most people talk about Japanese aging issues using this chronological age information, but that is very misleading. I mean, Japanese this proportion 65 and over, Japan is worse, yes, close to 30%. But actually, we should look at the cognition related, the adjusted dependence ratio. Japan is not that bad. In fact, you know, in the middle of the European level, not as good as the Northern European level, but it's definitely not that bad. But point is that in Japan, I think that John pointed out, you know, the retirement age is a big problem. And the retirement age started back in 1920s, and then you know, but even now we have the very tight age limit of the retirement, and we have to retire like age like 65, and whether although you're healthy, you still have to retire. And this, so I calculated sort of untapped work capacities due to the retirement. I mean, there's huge amount of wastage, and if you convert them into this labor force, then Japan's GDP will increase about 4 or 5% more, which is substantial. We call it the silver dividend due to the better health, the unused health capacity of our people. Now, I think the question is that how can I translate this cognition related benefit for Japan? You know, definitely I can use that information to the Japanese employers, policymakers. You know, look, I mean, Japanese people are not only healthy, but they're quite cognitively sound. So maybe we should utilize these people in a production capacity. You know, you can boost the GDP. Yep. So I think this is a policy issues, but I think the point is, this is key. Not many people, in fact, virtually nobody knows about this, the high cognition capacity of Japanese old people. I think we should disseminate this information throughout this country so that the people start reacting to that. And that's one thing we have to do. And also, one question that I have is that maybe within this retired or elderly persons, some people might have the very serious cognitive disease like dementia. You know, how many people actually have that? And I'm trying to calculate, you know, the healthy people, cognitively sound people among elderly persons, also some of the elderly persons suffering from the dementia. I think these are things that we're working on here at the ADBI. And but I think in the second half of your talk, you even expanded the scope, not cognition, not only cognition, but also health in general, which is quite impressive. And I really learned a lot from that part of your talk. But I think question is, you use 65 global average as a sort of cutoff. But, you know, back in 1980s, you know, the demographer George Myers said, you know, if you look at the aging process, the fertility decline is a major engine behind the aging process in the beginning, but toward the end of the population aging process, the extension retirement age, I mean, the life expectancy is quite important, because at the early stage of life expectancy improvement process, then the infant mortality, but toward the end, the mortality condition among the elderly persons start improving, so that contributes, that makes a difference. But I think key is that, according to him, George Myers, who used to be teaching at the Duke University, that the 70 is sort of cutoff age. Life expectancy is 70, then that's a stage where this further improvement of life expectancy or mortality start affecting the aging process. So I'm wondering, you use 65 as a cutoff age, but how about shifting the age cutoff age to 70 or maybe lower to the 60? I mean, would this change affect the overall results that you presented this afternoon? That's my question. Well, having said that, I mean, thank you very much, Vegard. I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiro. These comments are very helpful and useful. I think I think I support everything you say. I certainly think there should be a much stronger focus on functioning and health, and how well people are able to participate in the workforce in social life than the case is today. regards to your question, why did you use 65 as a cutoff? We could have used different ones for sure. We did also do some sensitivity analysis, and it showed basically a very similar pattern to the one I showed. But I think the reason we chose 65 has to do with retirement patterns around the world, that there are relatively few countries that have retirement ages nominal or certainly factual that lie around age 70. Mid 60s is much more common. It's actually quite common to have retirement ages in the early 60s, even late 50s. So that was the key reason why we chose 65 as a global cutoff or an anchor of comparison for countries around the world. We could have used different ones, and our sensitivity analysis suggests they would show largely very similar results in terms of world rank orderings.
Well,
Thanks very much. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, well, one thing is Vegard, I have a question. Why are we still using this age 65 as a cutoff age? You know, it started back in 1916. You know, when Isaac Rubinov started using it, and then 100 years later, even now, we're still using it. I mean, it's a time that we should really reconsider or remeasure. They come up with a new indices for measuring population aging.
Yeah, no, I certainly feel, and I hope this measure can be contributing to exactly that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So just picking up a couple of other questions in the Q&A box. Is a question by Peter Morgan of ADBI, who asks whether you have looked at the relationship between your measure and the labor force participation rate.
Next step, we haven't done it so far. We would like to do it, and of course the data are freely available now. It's all online, so it's also possible to look into. But that's the next step, basically.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question by Aiko Takenaka, who is basically looking at the difference between the traditional rate and your measure. So for countries where you see a large gap in these two measures, which of the two channels are playing the greater role? So that of what are the variations in the pattern across the countries?
If I understood the question correctly, whether it's demography or health, and it's certainly health that is the major driver of health in later life, where there's huge differences across countries in terms of how well they age, the proportion in poor health across countries. So, and we do find that health investments are closely associated with these cross-country variations. Countries that invest more in health age better.
Okay, thank you. Dean Sonobe, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Vegard, for the very excellent presentation. Very interesting. And then the last question from the Q&A box from Aiko Takenaka Kikawa. She's a leader of the ADB's headquarters aging project. So even though the chief economist, Albert Park, could not attend this webinar because of the sudden meeting, but Aiko has been here. So that's what I wanted Vegard to know. And then I have a question about the gap between the health adjusted dependency ratio and the old age dependency ratio, which is positive for some countries and negative for some countries, other countries. And then have you checked any correlates with that gap? And then what's your hypothesis about the positive and negative gap? Of course, the major one would be the development of healthcare system, but which aspect of healthcare system is important? For example, my classmate, Japanese classmate living in the United States, was saved by the very excellent high quality of healthcare service in the US. But why Japan performs better in terms of the health adjusted dependency ratio? And then another one is in the World Atlas you showed, comparing the HADR and the OADR. And then I found that Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine was kind of red or something like that. So it surprised me because then how the Ukraine can perform so well in the war if the health situation is not so good. So the second one is just a joke, but yeah, please answer the first one.
Right. So first of all, the situation in Eastern Europe is it's largely reflecting the fact that there has been very poor health occurring early and very rapid population age taking place across the board for Eastern European countries, including most former socialist republics, Ukraine, Russia, and other countries. So, but after the and some of these countries have been able to readjust and increase health tremendously, and others have not been able to do so. So things are changing very, very rapidly across Eastern Europe, and it'll be interesting to see how it develops. But I think when you look at the causes, first of all, with respect to health, it's important to say many health systems in Africa or in many other countries that are traditionally very young. They are focused on infectious disease, on perinatal health, and on maternal health, on women's early life diseases and illnesses and preventive care. For these age groups, they're not well adjusted for dealing with aging populations, which require a completely different health system and a completely different set of incentives for living healthy lives, and in terms of everything from physical activity, social activity, diets, avoiding specific risk factors, obesity, high BP, and so forth. And it's very important that one adjusts one's health systems accordingly to deal with all the populations, which are very different from how you deal with younger populations in terms of which services you should invest in. But it's also important to look at this in a holistic manner, and health services are important. I mentioned culture, having a modern culture, progressing to more gender equality, including women in the labor force, which many countries do not do, but is essential for how to deal well with aging. The same goes with how changing attitudes towards older workers, to accepting different roles. Maybe also all the workers have to be willing to accept some changes in work tasks, in salaries, and in terms of what type of occupations they have in order to deal well with aging. But I think it's a very holistic matter. So things that are related to improved health, improved infrastructure, improved societal levels of functioning in general, with high GDP, better schooling system, better functioning labor markets, better capital systems, capital markets. Those also relate to how well, how much you can invest in all the people, and how long you can keep it going at a high functional level. So adjust to an older society from a multidisciplinary perspective. It would be my answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vegard. If I could just ask a follow-up question. So from your charts, some of the rates are quite close to each other. So have you examined statistical differences between these? So for example, for a large number of countries, it would seem that the old age dependency ratio is actually the same as the new measure that you present. So in this case, you know, it doesn't really matter which measure is used.
Yeah.
But that's for quite a few of the countries.
Yeah, that's true, and it's often typically true for those countries that are in the middle, who are sort of more typical of the world average, and also in terms of aging, in terms of health. But it basically matters more for the extremes, if you like. Countries that are very young tend to have very different health adjusted and old age dependency ratios. Same goes for very old, demographically very old countries, which are very different in terms of the OADRs and their age ADRs. So I think it's important to separate these two, and to note that this brings doesn't only show that countries are much more similar in terms of aging. It also shows that extremes are much less extreme than if you'd like. There is no young or old world. The world is much more similar than what one typically would believe based on assessments of purely demographic trends.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have time for a final question, and it is posted by Yuriko Nakajima in the Q&A box. And it's quite a long question there, but basically the idea is to say something about the impact of population growth and how this would have an impact on your analysis, particularly as regards advanced versus the developing economies.
Yeah.
So
well, this
how does that play a role?
It's an excellent question. I think this is something we haven't gone so much into, but we should. Certainly, population growth cannot go on forever. No country could ever have above replacement fertility for an extended period of time, for a very long period of time. And all countries will end up eventually with a situation where one has more population stability, most likely, and you do have but there's going to be great differences in how well they age. That is the issue. So undergoing the demographic transition well depends on correct adjustments for an inevitable older population.
Okay, Vegard, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You've given us a lot of things to think about, certainly in the case of Japan and some of the countries where we've observed a high gap between the traditional measure and your new measure. I think it's something that we would need to look more deeply at in the years ahead, and we look forward to reading your further work on that issue. So that would be all from my side. If Dean Sonobe would wish to have any final comments.
Yeah, final question, may I ask?
Oh yes, sure. Go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
So the new measure is a combination, it's health, right? Health adjusted. So when you say health adjusted, how much, the cognitive function adjustment and how much the physical? How do you blend it?
Oh, so it's all diseases taken together. It doesn't include normal cognitive function, it includes dementia and specific neurodegenerative diseases, but it's slightly different. So the cognitively adjusted dependency ratio goes more on functioning. The health adjusted goes more on health and is more all-encompassing, encompasses almost all countries and has most diseases available. It's based on a very large data set. So I think these are two slightly different measures, and both take into account demography in addition to the functional health-related aspects.
I see.
Both take into account age distribution in addition.
I see. So do you think your new measure is the best measure so far?
Others will have to judge that. I think it's certainly, in terms of being better than the old age dependency ratio, no doubt, because it has it reflects reality, and age is chronological age is not doesn't say so much about how well you function, but it certainly needs to be tested and used more in the time ahead. And I hope it could be used much. It's easily available for across the world, and could say something more about how well countries age.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, great pleasure. Yeah, please come back and let's work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.